Hey, welcome back to Garbeardia. We have for you the next chapter of the Emily Bronze series. It's going to be a rather long chapter with a few parts because it's going to be very involved as we delve into the seedy underbelly of Las Vegas. There's also a poll to see which hotel she goes into. It's still up and be up until I say so. Damn it. Before we get to the actual video, of course we have our sponsors and affiliates. The first one being Redcon 1, where you go for all your supplement, dietary, and protein needs. There are links down below where you can get a percentage off your order, and I get a little kickback as well because that's how this fucking world works nowadays. If you don't need any protein or supplement drinks or a pre-workout, you can go over to Skull Splitter Dice, because I know you motherfuckers like your click-clack rocks now, don't ya? Skull Splitter Dice is a whole bunch of sets you guys can choose from for certain races, certain classes, certain flavors, all kinds of fun shit you can find over at Skull Splitter Dice. If you need any wargaming supplies, such as paint, brushes, and other such things, look up War Games Delivered. They're the other affiliate we have. If you need paint or brushes or any kind else you might need for tabletop wargaming needs, stop by War Games Delivered, see what they need for you, and see what they got. Besides that, the Veil Rider book is still on Amazon and on the Coffee page. And of course, speak of the Coffee page, if you really like the story, want to help support it even further than just watching it, please donate to the Coffee. It helps get the voice actors money that they need. Helps me keep the page running. I just spit everywhere. Helps me keep the page running because YouTube, I'm getting kind of bottlenecked, and it's interesting. It's watching the analytics. It's very curious. So support the channel by either donating via Coffee or buying a book or whatever else you all feel like doing. Enough of this redneck's ramblings. Let's get on to the chapter and why you got here.
Chapter 13. What happens in Vegas? The whine of the Super Stallion's engines mulled in Emily's ears, the sound barely dampened by the aviation headset she was wearing. Yapuya was happily chatting up the Gorgons who were flying the craft, both Gretchank and Prappily finding the little harpy's questions an amusing diversion from the tedium of level flying. Davin and Tarj were snoozing in their jump seats despite the noise, while Marill was reading a magazine that mostly covered old war birds through the ages. Emily found this flight a little less stomach-churning than the other, as the Gorgons were taking them on a straight arrow flight to the lake, or as close to it as they could get. The motorbike shifted back and forth as the helicopter buffeted in the wind, and Emily found herself slowly rocking to sleep in her own seat by the gunner window. As her mind drifted into the black, she felt the same icy chill she had when the architect had touched her before. In fact, it felt like the long, delicate fingers of the being were resting on her shoulders, and her breath puffed out of her nose in a light fog. The voice was light, but tinged with worry as the connection was made, and it wormed its way into her mind.
We have been found out. My crown is being moved. Danger is near.
Another familiar voice shoulder-checked itself into her mind, and she physically jumped from its sudden intrusion.
Enough of your shackles, old one. Emily, wake up, you fool.
The Torque's voice rattled her awake, her arms automatically sprawling out to clutch at the metal walls of the Super Stallion. She sputtered as she sat up, and she could hear multiple warning lights keening from the many sensors of the flight dash. She couldn't have been asleep for more than a few minutes, but by the light coming in through the gunner window, she had been knocked out for at least a couple hours.
Anomaly. Stone Serenade. To all flight channels, we have anomaly approaching.
Gretchank growled out, her many snake tendrils whirling about her head as they themselves turned dials with their mouths or pressed buttons to turn off warning lights. Emily turned her head to see Davin and Tarj now wide awake, while Marill was pulling back the charging handle on the other M2 in the other gunner window. Yapuya was busily checking her flight harness, just in case she had to duck out and make a wing for it.
Emily! Emily, get on your gun!
Marill cried, while Prappily was speaking into the radio as well.
Multiple flyers. They aren't large, but there's many of them. Why are they this far inland?
The Gorgon said with a snarl, and she slapped a large toggle on her flight dash. Another control stick rose from the spot between her feet, and Emily could hear a mechanical whirring from under the flight deck.
We have control. Going hot with the venom spitter?
Gretchank asked, her feet working the rudder pedals against the buffeting winds.
The 50s can't cover below us.
Prappily answered back, and she pulled down a visor from the top of her helmet. Emily blinked her eyes as she stood up and looked out the gunner window, and she sucked in a breath when she saw the vortex in the closing distance. It was immense, a guttural black and yellow cloud that whirled and boomed across the ground and sky. It was like a tornado, but it lacked a point, instead looking like some kind of horrific slinky as it bent and curled along its path of destruction. Ebony lightning crackled and shot out from within the vortex, and it looked as if it was trying to head them off. Emily noticed that they were nearing Vegas, and she could see planes veering away from their landing approach or purely being sucked out of the sky, caught in the core of the anomaly.
Why are we near Vegas?
Emily shouted into the mic, still peering out the window and watching the vortex contort and manic across the ground and sky. Gretchenk's voice filled her ears. There was bad weather on our approach to the lake. We had to go the long way. As the stone serenade got closer, the vortex stopped. It boiled and churned in place, and Emily swore that the onyx twister turned and looked at them, as if catching a scent on the air.
Yes, it is alive, and it's going to spit out some gifts in a moment. Get on that thing and get ready to repel boarders.
The Torque said, and she could feel it begin to warm on her neck.
Repel boarders? Are you nuts? Where the hell have you been?
Emily thought angrily, but she stood up, lifting up the top plate of the M2 to check for brass.
The ghastly thing that's latched onto you boxed me away so I couldn't interrupt her. Been shackled up for days. Here, look.
Emily felt the Torque draw her eyes towards the vortex, and it was standing still, or as still as a whirling cloud of black death could. It opened a part of itself as if it were a great maw, and dozens of black specks poured out in their direction, unfurling great dark wings that left trails of smoke in the sky.
Oh, shit!
Emily breathed, and the super stallion banked hard, attempting to get her guns on path and align itself with the Vegas airstrip. Prappily began to hiss in laughter as her chair began to spin, her visor tracking a target, and Emily could feel something underneath the craft spin with her. She let loose a test round at the figures with her own M2 to make sure it was feeding, then watched as a long tendril of plasma fire began to arc out from under the super stallion. The bolts of green plasma hissed through the air, and when they hit their target, the flapping horrors screeched and fell from the sky, their bodies instantly bursting into green flame. Emily didn't have much time to admire the weapon, as the flapping horrors were upon them within seconds. She pressed down the butterfly trigger, and the great gun boomed to life, lacing tracers through the sky and into the cloud of rushing figures. Marill was doing the same, but not as well, since her side was not fully facing the cloud. Gretchenk was putting them at a steep dive in order to gain speed, bleed altitude, and thus bring them closer to the airport. As the beings got closer, Emily saw that they were a mishmash of bat and eel, their greasy, furless bodies shining in the light despite their black and blue hue. The skin was so thin that she could see the pulses of muscle and the boil of organs in their bellies, and her own stomach churned at the sight. Their wings were still that of a bat, riddled with thick veins, but with longer claws that sliced at the air as they beat them through the sky. Most unwanted were their heads, eel-like, with long fangs and bulbous eyes that searched in arcs, looking for their prey.
Gross,
the Torque said, and Emily mentally agreed. She kept the hammer down on her machine gun, felling dozens of the beings as they kept their tightly packed formation in flight, and the green plasma weapon was scything through them as if they were naught but chaff. Tarj and Davin ready weapons in their seats, but more or less waited to see what was to come. It was actually going rather well, until the grotesque things got close enough and one was able to dive on the helicopter. Gretchenk was only a mile away from the airport when one of the beings was lit up by the plasma weapon, but it continued its dive, bouncing off the large exterior fuel tank with a bong of skull hitting steel. The weight of the creature was enough to shear away the entire sponson and cause a fuel fire on Marill's side of the craft, and the centaur ducked away from the flames that licked at her window. Gretchenk spoke into the headset, still calm despite the chaos, and she looked over her shoulder. Fire on left sponson, going to the deck.
Do what you must!
Prappily shouted, her chair still swiveling slightly as she kept sending streams of plasma at her targets. One of her snaky tendrils was eyeing a gauge, and it opened its mouth in a hiss as the gauge's pointer began to lean towards a red section. Prappily jerked her eyes towards the snake, another tendril coming down to quickly watch her visor for her.
Yes, I know it's overheating. Just make sure we don't hit the black.
Emily wanted to ask what the black did, But she didn't have the moment as her ammo feeder ran dry. She leaned down to grab another large can, but a sudden shudder on her side of the craft made her jerk back up and look at the window. A black talon gripped the rim of the viewport, and she watched as a long eel-like head loomed into view.
Oh, fuck you, dude!
Emily screamed, and she whipped her CZ-75 from her shoulder holster, squeezing off rounds in a rapid staccato. Despite the horrified screeching of both Yapuya and Tarj as the eel head shunted in through the port, Emily put 4 out of 10 rounds into the face of the thing, the last round blowing whatever worked for its brain out of the back of its fishy skull. The figure slumped and messily slid down the wall of the super stallion, but not before its wing claw came down and tangled itself in the M2's gunner emplacement, ripping it through the wall of the fuselage and leaving a gaping hole in its armor.
Nice one.
Davin said with a smile, holding his scorpion in his lap while beside him Tarj was trying not to pass out.
Shut up!
Emily shouted back, and she pulled out her mare's leg, spotting other figures looming towards the gap. Davin chuckled and stood up from his seat, checking for brass in his submachine gun while Marill steadied herself, her own sawn-off custom M2 pointing out the gash. Tarj blew out a cheek full of air, then stood up with his M240B, holding it in a walking fire position. Within seconds, more figures swarmed the gap, and the weight caused the stone serenade to lilt in that direction.
What in the hell are you doing?
Gretchenk began to ask, turning to look over her other shoulder, but saw nothing but flashes of light as the occupants she was transporting let loose a barrage of gunfire. Creatures slid across the deck of the super stallion or flew off into the sky, tumbling down to the dusty ground below. Never mind, Gretchenk finished with a smile, and she turned back to her duties. They were less than half a mile from the airfield enclosing, and she could see that the Vegas airstrip was bringing its defense cannons online, the long-barreled weapon slowly swiveling towards her own bird.
Oh shit.
Prappily breathed as multiple lock signals began to dance across her screens. Gretchenk turned a knob on the radio and toggled her mic.
Stone serenade to Vegas air defense. You have us locked.
We know. We're trying to lock the things attached to you.
A voice came back across the radio, and Gretchenk tilted her head in exasperated acknowledgement.
That is very nice, but please no. Lock the ones not on our bird.
There was a pause, and the guns began to swivel away from the stone serenade, instead locking onto the non-attached creatures. The multi-barreled turrets of the airfield glittered to life, sending up streams of red-hot plasma, laser bursts, or just plain old solid munitions into the air and knocking down their own targets. This had little effect on the stone serenade as it plummeted towards the airstrip, and another fireball erupted from the top right engine. Gretchenk bent down to look up and see one of the eel-faced bat creatures had suicide dove into it, its body still dangling out of the engine's cowling filter as a fireball engulfed it. As Gretchenk turned a radio knob, her snaky hair tendrils began to pull on extinguisher knobs with her teeth or fuss with the fuel handles, directing it away from the burning engine. The super stallion lurched with the lack of the engine.
Ah, fuck me.
Gretchenk muttered under her breath, then toggled her mic.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. Stone serenade to Vegas. Engine out and on fire. Going in for a rough landing. Heading southwest across turret battery 3. 7 souls on board.
Emily and Marill skidded backwards on the deck as the aircraft lurched, Gretchenk adding even more dive and speed in the hopes that if she lost power, she could auto-rotate at the last minute. Marill scooped up Emily as they slammed against the opposite wall of the fuselage, both of them getting the wind knocked from their lungs. Emily coughed and brought up her mare's leg, putting a .357 Ursa penetrator through the chest of a charging abomination. The round ripped through the creature, throwing shattered ribcage and spine out through its ghastly exit passage, then buried itself into the head of the creature behind the first. The eel-like head of the creature recoiled in horror at the burning hot round making a home in its thick skull, then was felled to the deck when Yapuya pulled out a crowbar and belted it across the chin. Davin and Tarj were keeping up a steady rate of fire, bracing themselves against the motorbikes and keeping the boarders at bay. Dead creatures tumbled through the gash in the side of the fuselage, dead or marred, and quickly began to outnumber the humanoid occupants. Prappily took off her helmet, as her turret was no longer able to shoot due to overheating, and picked up her own custom Dabrowski Gatling stubber, a 3-barreled rotary 7.62x51 submachine gun. Both Prappily and her hair tendrils hissed as the Gorgon advanced on the impromptu door that had been made in her bird, her weapon rattling to life and spitting out a hail of bullets from its drum magazine. The weapon was deafening and blindingly bright as it spit empty brass casing in a waterfall down onto the flight deck. while the bullets themselves ripped anything it touched apart, leaving nothing but shreds of bone and meat where a living thing used to be. Muriel helped both her and Emily stand, the two still coughing as smoke began to fill the passenger area.
We're really low to the ground,
The Torque said, and indeed Emily could hear the tones of the flight dash calling out to Gretchenk. She couldn't even hear the Gorgon over the rapid tones of the alarms, the maddening buzzing and whoop-whoop of the altitude sensor. Prappily spun round and looked out the front windscreen of the Stone Serenade, the looming sight of the turret batteries and hangars speeding towards them. Then scrambled back into her seat to help land the ailing craft. Fire still furled and guttered out of their stricken engine, but the creatures were held at bay by the now supporting airstrip turrets. Emily flinched as a Wyvern rapid abatement turret lit up the sky next to the Super Stallion, burning away anything else that was clinging to the side of the fuselage. One creature, however, made a mad dive, seeking to secure its mission, and dove headfirst into the tail rotor just as the Stone Serenade began its auto-rotation on its last two engines. The Super Stallion jerked, shuddered, then began to spin, and Emily was dragged across the flight deck and into the motorcycles. Everyone else fumbled and rolled across the deck, screaming until they came across something they could hold, while the dead creatures began to flail and get sucked out of the hole of which they entered. "Brace!" Gretchen cried out, her arm working the collective and flight stick while her feet pressed hopefully at the anti-torque pedals. "Brace for impact!" Emily clutched at her Zundap as the world continued to spin, the Super Stallion twisting and whirling through the air in its mad dash for the tarmac of the airport. Moril was bellowing angrily as she held on to a set of jump seats, while Yapuya seemed oddly jubilant at this mad ride they were on, still holding on to the bloody crowbar. The warning alarms from the flight dash were feverish now, the whoop-whoop as deafening as the roar of the struggling engines and the chop of the rotor blades.
We lost our tail.
Prappily said quickly, both her and her hissing tendrils looking back and forth, getting a slideshow picture of where they were going. Gretchenk was manically working every control surface she could, her pointed teeth bared in a frustrated snarl. "I have a little, but it's not going to be enough." The Super Stallion spun over the turret line, the gunners running out to watch the craft as the anti-anomaly engines began to buzz to life some 100 or so yards away. Black smoke poured out of both its stricken engine and the Taylor rotor boom, which wobbled noisily with the sound of tortured metal. Emily puffed breath in and out through her lips as her arms strained to hold onto her Zundap, her feet flailing in the air as the G's began to slowly build and pull on her. She looked up for a moment and saw that the same thing was happening to both Tarj and Davin, the human and orc almost weaving themselves into the webbing of the jump seats. Yapuya was still secure inside her little corner and was chewing on a candy bar she had tucked in her pocket. The alarm whoops began to speed up as the Stone Serenade neared the ground ever faster, and Gretchenk and Prappely's voices were loud in Emily's mind, as they were clutching their controls so tightly they were toggling the open aircraft mic. 50 feet. Let's try and aim for that patch right there," Gretchenk mused, working the failing craft and pulling up on her collective for the final time.
This is it, baby!
Prappily yelled, while outside the craft Emily could hear the distant cracking boom of the anti-anomaly engines discharging, as well as the rapid brrrt of defense turrets shooting at something. Emily heard the remaining two engines whine, then felt the world around her shudder as the Super Stallion came down hard onto the ground. Emily lost her grip on her Zundap and was tossed through the air, her body bouncing and ragdolling along the ground while Moril screeched, the impact causing her to rip out one of the jump seats. The Centaur slid across the deck along with Emily, and Moril scooped the human into her arms. Tarj went rolling over the top of Davin, and the two held on to each other, as Tarj was a mere foot away from being pulled out of the gash in the side of the aircraft. The Stone Serenade twisted as it came down, the tail boom shearing away and smashing into the main rotors with a bone-shattering crash. Pieces of rotor flew through the air or impacted down into the dirt with a shower of erupted earth. The impact of the tail boom into the rotors caused one last mighty jerk to the fuselage of the felled Stone Serenade. But the Sea Stallion soon came to a halt as dust pillowed out from its form. Its engine keened and whined as if apologizing for the rough landing, but the bird was at least resting on its wreckage of an undercarriage. Inside, Gretchenk coughed out painfully as she toggled switches to kill the engine, while beside her Prappily moaned out in pain. Her helmet having clattered against the flight dash on the first impact due to her forgetting to put back on her harness. Dust and smoke curled in the air inside the passenger area, but figures stirred within the gloom. Emily opened an eye to see that she was upside down and looking at her own knees. as both she and Muriel had been tossed into the farthest corner of the rear exitway, the drop ramp just to their left. Emily looked up and saw that while Muriel was alive, she was definitely unhappy, as a large gash had been torn open on the side of her head. The centaur looked down at Emily with a pained smile. "Ugh. You make it?" Emily coughed again. "Yeah, you?" "Probably. Taj? Devin?" There was a grunt and a curse as multiple bags were kicked away from a pile of wreckage, but a pair of hands poked up from the bundle.
We're alive.
Davin groaned, pulling Taj up with him. Yopuya poked her head up from her little corner and sniffled, a couple of cuts across her cheek.
That sucked. Yupira rather fly by self next time.
Gretchenk and Prappoli both stood up shakily and wobbled their way towards the exit doors, kicking away dead horrors as they did. Prappoli mashed the release for the ramp, and by some miracle it still worked, lowering down with a groan and shriek of displaced metal.
Thank you for flying Gorgon Airlines,
Prappoli said with a bloody-lipped smile, and medical personnel swarmed the ramp as soon as it touched down to the ground. As Emily sipped at her almost empty Mai Tai, her eyes scanning over a few pages of map that the Vegas airstrip personnel had been kind enough to provide her, her cheek was a mess of bandages, one of her hands was wrapped in a flexible gauze so she could still use it, and she had gotten a small cut across her nose, the band-aid of which kept fussing with her eye focus. The map was a mesh of satellite images, and were provided once Ogledock had a quick call with the team that handled such things at the airstrip. A massive storm was covering the lake that was once Fort Mojave, and was not natural by any means, as it never leaved or moved, just rumbled over the lake itself, while the drink cooled her injury-free hand, the middle finger of her bandaged one traced down her furrowed eyebrow. Emily swiveled her eyes towards the rest of her little party, most of whom were either napping in their circular booth seat or stuffing their faces with chicken nachos. Gretchenk and Prappoli, while battered and bruised, had already set off with their expedient insurance payment to shop for another aircraft, and let Emily know they would be back to either help them still or ferry them back home. Both of the motorcycles had survived the crash and were parked outside, basking in the warm sun despite the scratched paint and multiple dents they had garnered. Most of the nacho eating was coming from Davin and Yopuya, while Tarj was getting in a solid power nap for the rest of them. Muriel was already into her 5th White Russian, her face broody underneath her own painting of bandages. The bar they were resting in was one of the few that were located right off the airstrip. This particular dive, called the Tail Gunner, it was renowned for both its venom-tongued human barwoman and the goblin chef who ran the kitchen, the duo being masters in their own right at their craft. The goblin chef strode out from the kitchen, hefting more chicken nachos and a plate of buffalo sliders that were ringed around a mound of crispy batter fries. His French accent was as thick as the mayonnaise he had made in his kitchen from scratch.
Madame Frey, the pansement de marche looks low on her drink.
Frey's face soured at the goblin as he walked by, a playful smile on his lips.
Roch, if she wanted a drink, she would ask for one. I'm sure she is fully capable of talking.
Roch opened his mouth in a laugh, his pointed fangs glinting happily as he set down the plates in front of Davin and Yopuya. Frey sniffed, her brown pixie cut the same length of her patience that she held for her work partner. Frey's blue eyes were framed by the black painted bar she had across her face from temple to temple, giving the barwoman a warrior-like appearance. Emily sipped the last of her glass and smiled up at Frey, giving it a little wiggle.
Well, I wouldn't say no to another.
Frey looked at Emily, but smirked and plucked the glass from her fingers.
Don't encourage him. If he keeps this up, I'll have to say his béarnaise sauce is too thin to take him down a notch.
Emily didn't really know what béarnaise sauce was, but she smiled politely at the joke all the same. Emily rubbed at her face as she leaned back from the bar, the cushioned seat squeaking lightly as she did. As Frey shook the tumbler she held, she raised her chin towards Emily.
What's with the maps?
Trying to figure out what to do.
Emily sighed out, and the torque hummed on her neck.
Careful. Don't give too much away.
I know, Nicholas, Emily thought, and Frey squinted an eye, slapping the side of her tumblers to uncouple them.
What to do about what?
Emily chuckled softly in her throat. I am Emily of Ogledock's Recovery and Survey, and I am burdened with a gnawing purpose.
Ah, one of those, eh? Gotta run down some evil big bad before the world is brought to ruin?
Frey said with a smile, pulling out ice from a bin with tongs and dropping them into a clean glass.
Had a few of those in here over the last few years. Rock, wasn't there some spaceship crew in here just the other day?
Rock, who had been taking an order from Marill for a bacon cheeseburger, turned and looked over his shoulder.
Oh, you mean those dusty people who had to pay in literal bullion? Yes, I remember them. Wonderful, madam. Dark Skin was angry about losing a weapon too. Their captain says they were heading back south to help with the purifier.
And then we had some elven prince lay over in here. Was sent by his kingdom to find some kind of enchanted mask or whatever. I told him about the movie, but he didn't find my joke very funny.
Faye said, pouring Emily's drink and then plopping a vodka-soaked Obado cherry on top of the ice. Not a fan of the classics? Emily asked, taking the Mai Tai and sipping from it with an exhale of the nose. Faye shrugged.
Must not have been. That or he didn't get the link.
She emptied Emily's old glass into a sink and placed it down onto a spray cleaner.
So, what has the universe tasked you with?
Saving the world, Emily muttered into her glass, taking another sip.
Nothing too important then.
Faye said errantly and placed the now clean glass next to its brothers and sisters. Roch sidled past behind her, tapping Emily on the shoulder with his pen.
Your big friend has quite the appetite. I like her.
Yeah, she's pretty good stock, Emily replied, and she noticed Marill's ears perk up at the words. The goblin lowly chuckled all the way to the kitchen, pushing past the swinging door into the bustle and noise of pots and pans. Emily took another sip, glancing towards Marill and seeing the centaur quickly look back down at her phone, her face illuminating both her flushed, happy face and Tarja's snoring one. Emily blinked, then looked back to Frey as the Torque's voice entered her mind.
What are we drinking? You're getting buzzed off of what seems like fruit juice. Anyway, ask about any rumors. The architect has you running missions for her and appears the enemy know your movements. A bit suspect if you ask me, but no one does.
Baby, Emily growled in her mind, but she followed the advice anyway. So, Frey, have there been any other rumors running around this place? Frey shrugged her hands, one of them holding half a cut orange.
Swarming with them, attacks on the big water purifier are doubling up. And there's almost an entire multi-nation and dimension army down there. The cultists are on the move across land now and are setting up shop all over the place. No one knows why it started, but they quite literally lurched into action like they got a hot poker to the butt cheek.
On the move where? Emily asked, taking a long sip of her Mai Tai.
Everywhere. The homeless at Panhandle on the Strip have been talking about fish people being in the sewers. There are massive shanty towns down there, where it's cool and sometimes you can hear muffled gunfire from underneath the roads or from the storm drains. There are also a lot less panhandlers, which is worrying.
Emily blanched, remembering what happened to the poor harpy in the forest. Then the Torque's voice entered her mind.
Reminds me of a tale from my realm. A great being of lust and flesh desired to keep a precious artifact of her safe, squirreling it away inside her great palace of pleasure.
It wasn't some kind of personal toy, was it? Emily asked, snorting to herself, which confused Frey, and Emily had to wave it off. Sorry, remembered something one of the pilots said.
Oh, good. I thought you found the idea of Hobicide funny or something.
Frey said with a raised brow, but the Torque continued.
No, it wasn't. Anyway, my mistress wanted it for herself.
Definitely a vibe, Emily said to the Torque, and she giggled out loud again. Frey stopped mid-glass cleaning, and a few others down from her seat at the bar gave Emily a puzzled look.
It was not a vibe, whatever in the realms that is. My mistress wanted it, but knew that if she took it, the other being would come for her.
Why aren't you using names? Trying to keep it a secret or something? You're being very aloof with this storytelling. Emily could actually hear the Torque mentally facepalm inside her mind, and his voice dragged on from a narrative tone to one of exasperation.
Maybe that wretch had done a favor locking me away. I forgot how tedious you are at times. I cannot speak their names, and no, I'm not telling you why. Long story short, since you keep interrupting me, my mistress hid it in the one place the being of lust would not look. My mistress invited her to her own citadel of brass and steel to try and find it, and for centuries she looked and looked. Unbeknownst to her, my mistress had hid it away under her own feet, right inside her own pleasure palace.
Are you saying the cultists moved the crown back to Utah? Emily asked, and she started to feel as if the Torque had a point.
Not Utah, but where you think they would not hide it. If I had to wager, it's probably right here in the city of radiance and delights where the dregs of society keep going missing. Cultists require meat in order to grow in power, and this city would be full of it. While they seem to abhor eating humanoid flesh, they are adapting, and are so far inland from seawater, they may just change their taste. To me, this whole thing of creating a storm over the lake seems like a red herring to try and drag you there, all the while the crown is safe and secure in the bowels of the city you travel to and fro from.
Do you think they're that smart, though?
They're smart enough to know what your benefactor is up to. These old creatures are all tied together one way or another, so this may be more of an uphill battle than you really know. Don't worry, I'll be here.
Soothing, Emily remarked, and the Torque exhaled a laugh in her head. Roch walked back out of the kitchen with the massive bacon cheeseburger and chili cheese fries Muriel had ordered, but also one other plate resting on his forearm as he strode towards the table of survivors. As the goblin passed by, he placed a heaping plate of croque monsieur and tater tots in front of Emily, giving her a cheeky smile before walking the rest of the way towards Muriel. The smell of beef, chili, and fat jerked Tarj awake from his slumber, and Yopuya had her hand rapidly slapped away by Muriel, the harpy covered in bits of nacho chips and cheese. Tarj put in an order for the same thing to Roch, who ahoed and wrote it down happily. The intoxicating aroma of bechamel and crispy tater tots scrubbed away the worry from Emily's mind, and her stomach rumbled, now realizing the only thing she had eaten ever since takeoff was alcohol and a bowl of cereal. Frey pulled out the classic red bottle of ketchup and thunked the glass vessel in front of her as Roch was walking by. The goblin stopped with a squeak of the heel, and he turned his head, eyeballing the bottle. Frey had a mischievous smirk on her face as Roch spoke, and Emily picked up the bottle.
I hope that is for the tater tots and not going in my bechamel.
Emily stopped mid-pour, the lip of the bottle hovering over the taupe piece of the croque monsieur. Yes?
Pour it on the bread. I want to see if this little goblin will fight you,
the Torque said, and she felt a little nudge at her hand muscles. Quiet, Emily thought, then moved the bottle towards an empty space on her plate. She heard Roch hum in his throat, then go back on his way towards the kitchen. Frey leaned in.
I like ketchup with mine, too. Oh no, someone touched this one.
She leaned in, plucking a tater tot from her plate and plopping it into her mouth as she turned to resume pouring a beer for another customer. The men and women around her at the bar chuckled as Emily gave Frey a sardonic scowl, picking up her own tot and dipping it in ketchup. After the party had ate their fill and chatted more with Roch about goblin kitchen culture, the now food baby-bearing team left out to their motorbikes, the sky dipping down towards early evening. Emily double-checked the bags attached to her own bike were still secure, mulling over in her head about the Torque's words. Would the opposing forces of the architect be as clever as to hide it right under her nose? Did they expect her to follow her orders to the T like a good little neophyte and walk right into a trap? How did they even know she was on the trail anyway? The thoughts made her brain hurt, and Davin walked up to her, slinging his scorpion over his back.
Problem there, chosen one?
Emily shook her head, sighing. What if we're walking into a trap, Davin?
We probably are, honestly. Big storm over our AO, we got attacked on our approach. There's an information leak, that's for sure.
Davin murmured, pulling out a small pack of gum and tossing a piece into his mouth. The Torque thinks that they're hiding the crown underneath Vegas, Emily stated flatly, not wanting to beat around the bush with a man like Davin. Davin, to his credit, raised his eyebrows as he chewed, watching Yopuya pretend to drive his Indian motorcycle, fake engine noises and all.
That would make sense, but there's only one way to find out. If you ask me, if they know where we're going, then they know what we're after. Even if we just end up wasting time, it puts them on the back foot since there won't be any fish in their net.
Emily nodded, then called over Muriel and Tarj, letting them know their intentions. Tarj just shrugged, happy to hear they wouldn't be flying again. Muriel just scratched at her collarbone when she heard the news. The sewers! City like this must be almost a mirror image underneath.
We'll have to invest in some other equipment too, like dwarven foam flashlights, radio location so we don't get lost, and probably some masks wouldn't be remiss either. No telling what's oozing in those tunnels.
Emily looked at Maril, surprised, and the centaur looked away, now scratching your neck.
I went on a few delves in my world. I've learned a thing or two about fighting underground. It's all Gucci until someone sets off a firebomb or a gas trap explodes.
Noted, Emily said with a smile, grabbing her helmet as Tarj settled into the Zundab sidecar.
And that's the end of this part of chapter 13. We'll see you next week, hopefully. If not, we'll see you by the end of the month for the next chapter. Because I'm trying to put more effort into these. You know, I got more voice actors. It takes a bit more production to get them going. You know, and yeah. So I really hope you guys are enjoying the different kind of style I'm going for here, narration wise. Not just me and Beldam, but me, Beldam, Cora, and Aristic, and sometimes Likely. If you like the story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbeardia. Stop by the coffee, our affiliates down below. There'll also be a link to the Discord down below. These are numerically gated, so we can kind of control the flow of people coming in, because things got a bit too spicy in the last Discord and it's no longer here. So anyway, thank you for stopping by. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being just here and being fans of the channel. It really does a lot for me morale-wise. It does more for this little old veteran than y'all think. Having you guys here, listening, commenting on the Discord, it helps me out a lot. And I just want to say that I appreciate you. I really do. But until I see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Garbro, that's Cora, that Aristic, that's the Beldam, and this is Garbeardia.